The bond didn't just break. It screamed. It wasn't a rumor whispered by the gossiping kitchen maids or a decree posted on the stone walls of Valdron. It was the soul tether itself, that invisible, ancient cord linking her spirit to his, stretching until it frayed, then snapping with the force of a physical blow. The sudden, hollow void in her chest was terrifying, a cold numbness that replaced the warmth she had carried since the moment their eyes first met. Sable gasped, her lungs seizing as she collapsed against the cold servants' gallery railing. Down below, in the great hall, the air was thick with the scent of expensive incense, heavy floral arrangements, and noble sweat. Theron, her Theron, stood before the high priest, his shoulders broad and back straight, his voice steady and kingly as he spoke the name of Ione Ravencourt. He was claiming her. He was branding another woman's soul in front of the entire realm, formally weaving a lie into the fabric of their history. Every word of the vow felt like a hot iron pressed against Sable's skin, a searing brand of rejection that made her vision blur. She should have seen this coming. She was a ghost in the corridors, an orphan with no lineage, a servant whose only purpose was to polish the silver the highborn ate from. She was a nobody, trying to tether herself to a son, a girl who had mistaken a king's temporary comfort for a permanent sanctuary. The memories rushed back like a cruel taunt, the way his hands had felt rough yet gentle against her face in the moonlit gardens, the heat of his breath when he whispered that she was his anchor against the rising madness of the throne, the golden glow in his alpha eyes that told her she was the only one who truly saw the man beneath the crown. Those memories were now nothing but ash, bitter and choking. But the crown had won. Queen Revina's ultimatum had been the blade, and Theron had been the executioner, sacrificing their sacred bond for the sake of a stable bloodline and a quiet court. He had made his choice. Now, Sable would make hers. She didn't wait for the celebratory cheers to erupt or the sound of the ceremonial drums to signal the end of the union. She turned, slipping into the shadows of the servants' passage, a blur of gray fabric and desperate, trembling movements. She bypassed the kitchen doors where the feast was being prepared and slipped past the guards, men who had looked at her 1,000 times and never once truly seen her. To them, she was just another piece of the castle's background, as invisible as the dust on the floorboards. She ran until the lights of the castle were nothing but a dying ember in the distance, a fading spark of a life she no longer possessed. She ran until the air grew thick and the trees of the Blackwood began to knit together like skeletal fingers, swallowing her whole in their suffocating embrace. She didn't stop until her legs gave out beneath the weight of the agony, falling into the damp dirt where the world was silent and cold. She would not stay to watch him mark Ione. She would not be the silent shadow watching another woman carry his heirs, wear the Morvain jewels, and share his bed while she withered away in the servants' quarters. If the forest wanted to claim her, let it. It was better to be consumed by the wild and the forgotten than to stay and be erased by the man who was supposed to be her destiny. The stone of the kitchen tunnels was damp and smelled of stale yeast and old secrets, a labyrinthine underworld that had been Sable's only true home. She ran with a frantic, stumbling grace, her thin leather slippers slapping against the uneven floorboards. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Behind her, the muffled roar of the great hall, the cheers, the scraping of heavy oak chairs, the high-pitched trill of noble laughter, sounded like the mocking chorus of a life that had never belonged to her. She was the invisible girl, the shadow that filled the water carafes and mended the torn hems of silk gowns, and now she was simply a ghost haunting her own exit. She didn't grab a cloak or a satchel of bread. To take anything from the castle felt like tethering herself to the lie. She wanted to be empty, to be as hollow as the space Theron had carved out of her chest. Half a mile away, beneath the vaulted gold ceilings of the royal altar, the world suddenly tilted on its axis. Theron, the Alpha King of Valdron, felt a coldness so absolute it froze the marrow in his bones. He was standing with Ione's hand in his, the ceremonial mark still fresh and stinging on her wrist, but the physical sensation was drowned out by a psychic scream. The tether, the real one, the one he had tried to ignore under the crushing weight of his mother's threats, wasn't just fraying. It was fading. He gasped, his knees buckling as he gripped the edge of the stone altar to keep from falling. His wolf roared in the back of his mind, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that made the highborn guests recoil in sudden terror. Theron. Ione's voice was a distant buzz, like an insect trapped in amber. He couldn't answer. He was focused on a single, rhythmic pulse that was growing fainter with every second. Thump, thump, thump. It was Sable's heartbeat, drifting further away, bleeding out into the darkness of the Blackwood. He felt the exact moment she crossed the threshold of the castle wards. It felt like a limb being severed without anesthesia. In the tunnels, Sable pushed through the heavy iron-bound door that led to the refuse pits. The night air hit her like a physical blow, smelling of pine needles and impending rain. She didn't look back at the towering spires of the fortress or the flickering torchlight in the windows. She plunged into the treeline, her small frame swallowed by the ancient, reaching oaks of the Blackwood. Back at the altar, the king let out a sound that wasn't human, a guttural, grieving howl that shattered the crystal flutes on the nearby tables. His mother, Queen Revina, stepped forward, her face a mask of pale fury, but Theron didn't see her. He saw only the darkness where his soul used to be. The bond was a flat line. The invisible girl was gone, and for the first time in his life, the king of Valdron was truly alone in the dark. He didn't care about the crown or the treaty. He only cared about the silence where a heartbeat should have been. He had sacrificed the moon to save the sun, and now he was drowning in the eclipse. The air in the great hall curdled, the celebratory scent of lilies and spiced wine turning to the metallic tang of ozone and raw, unfiltered power. Theron didn't just stand. He surged, the movement so violent it sent the ceremonial chalice skittering across the stone floor, spilling red wine like a trail of fresh blood. The high priest stepped back, his hands trembling as he held the sacred scroll, his mouth hanging open in a silent plea for order. But the king was no longer listening to the laws of men or the decrees of gods. His eyes had bled from their human amber into a terrifying, molten gold that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying star. Queen Revina moved with the practiced grace of a predator, her hand reaching out to catch Theron's arm, her voice a sharp, disciplined whip. She spoke of the treaty, of the Ravencourt alliance, and the fragile peace they had spent decades brokering. Theron didn't even look at her. With a single, dismissive snarl, he shrugged off her touch, the sheer force of his aura knocking the breath from her lungs. He was the Alpha, and the woman he had just claimed was a stranger to his soul, while the one who truly owned him was fading into the black. He turned his gaze toward the back of the hall where the captain of the guard stood. Corvin Blackmere didn't need a formal command. He saw the devastation in his king's eyes and felt the primal vibration of a command that superseded all military protocol. Theron's voice didn't just fill the room. It shook the very foundations of Valdron. He ordered the kingdom locked down, every gate barred, every silver-threaded passage sealed, and every scent trail catalogued. He didn't care if the trade routes stalled or if the nobility felt like prisoners in their own silk-lined chambers. Theron descended from the dais, a whirlwind of velvet and fur, ignoring Ione as if she were a statue of salt. He began to tear the pack apart with a terrifying, singular focus. He moved through the ranks of his highest-ranking wolves, his nostrils flaring as he sifted through the scents of lavender, old parchment, and expensive oils, searching for the one scent they had all stepped over for years. He tore through the servants' quarters, ripping doors from their hinges and appending the modest pallets of the staff. The nobles watched in horrified silence as their king dropped to his knees in the middle of a dusty corridor, his fingers digging into the stone. In that moment of absolute desperation, the air around her didn't just turn cold, it froze. A hum, ancient and resonant, vibrated through her bones, and when her eyelids snapped open, the hazel of her irises had vanished. In their place was a searing, luminous silver that cut through the darkness, like a celestial blade. The shadows at her feet didn't behave like light anymore. They became liquid. As the rogue leaped, the darkness rose from the forest floor like a wall of living ink, hardening into obsidian-sharp tendrils. They lashed out with impossible speed, catching the lead wolf midair and hurling him back into the darkness. The other rogues skidded to a halt, their predatory confidence replaced by a whimpering, instinctual terror. They didn't see a servant girl anymore. They saw a Veil Walker awakening. The very shadows of the Blackwood began to coil around Sable's small frame, shielding her in a shroud of midnight silk that hissed at the encroaching predators. She stood in the center of the clearing, her silver gaze fixed on the monsters before her, realizing for the first time that while the king had claimed the sun, she was becoming the mistress of the dark. The hunters had become the prey, and the Blackwood, which she had feared would be her grave, was starting to feel like her throne. The silver light receding from Sable's eyes left the world in a blur of charcoal and bruised indigo. The rogue wolves had vanished into the mist, their yelps of terror still echoing through the jagged ravines, but the shadows that had risen to protect her did not simply dissipate. They curled around her ankles like loyal hounds, humming with a frequency that made her teeth ache. Before she could succumb to the bone-deep exhaustion threatening to pull her into the dirt, a figure emerged from the heart of the Blackwood, not with the heavy tread of a soldier, but with the silent, predatory grace of something that had predated the kingdom itself. He was a massive gray wolf, his fur the color of winter storms and his eyes a piercing, ancient blue that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. As he stepped into the clearing, the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and crushed herbs. With a fluid, shimmering motion that defied the laws of nature, the wolf stood on two legs, his form shifting and elongating until a man stood where the beast had been. He was tall, draped in furs that looked like they were woven from the forest's own moss, his face lined with the wisdom of 1,000 moons. "Peace, little spark," he said, his voice a low resonance that settled the frantic beating of her heart. The shadows only answer to their mistress. Sable stumbled back, her hands outturned. "Who are you? Why did you save me?" "I am Cakes," he replied, his gaze never leaving her silver-tinged eyes. "And I saved you, because I have spent 20 years waiting for the veil to thin enough for you to find me." He moved closer, the very trees seeming to lean toward him in deference. "You call yourself an orphan, Sable. You believe you are a girl of no consequence, a servant who accidentally caught a king's eye. But your nothingness was the most expensive lie ever told in Valdron." Sable shook her head, the agony of Theron's betrayal flaring anew. "I am a nobody. The king chose a noble because I have no bloodline. I have nothing." Cakes let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like snapping twigs. "You have the only bloodline that matters. You were hidden in the servants' quarters not because you were unwanted, but because you were too dangerous to be found. Your parents didn't abandon you. They sacrificed their lives to place you in the shadows, knowing that the king's enemies, and perhaps the king himself, would fear a veil walker who could unmake their sacred bonds with a single thought." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her forehead. "You are not a servant girl who lost a mate, Sable. You are the architect of fate. Your status was a shroud, and the Blackwood is not your grave. It is your armory. It is time to stop running from a bond that was beneath you and start learning how to command the darkness that has been waiting for its queen." Sable looked at the old man, the silver spark returning to her vision, realizing that the nobody Theron had rejected was the only person in the realm capable of tearing his world apart. The air within the royal private solar did not just grow cold, it became a vacuum, a space where the very oxygen seemed to ignite under the friction of Theron's escalating fury. Maps of Valdron were swept from the heavy mahogany desk as the Alpha King paced, his movements no longer those of a statesman, but of a caged beast realizing the bars of his cell were made of his own mother's lies. Outside, the kingdom was a portrait of paralysis. The bells of celebration had been silenced by royal decree, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of Corvin's armored search parties and the low, anxious howling of a pack that could feel their leader's sanity fracturing. Queen Revina stood by the hearth, her posture as rigid and unyielding as the crown she so desperately sought to protect. She watched him with a clinical detachment that finally snapped the last thread of Theron's restraint. "You did this for the realm," she said, her voice a cool vial of poison. "A servant's life is a small price for a dynasty's survival. I gave her a choice, Theron. Her life or your throne. She chose to run like the coward she is." The silence that followed was more violent than a scream. Theron stopped mid-stride, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the stone floor as his power flared, blowing out the candles in the wall sconces. He turned to her, his eyes two burning pits of molten gold, his voice a low, guttural vibration that rattled the glass in the windows. "You didn't give her a choice, Mother. You threatened the only light in this god's-forsaken castle because you couldn't control it." The revelation that Sable had fled not out of a broken heart, but to spare him the pain of her execution, ripped through Theron like a physical blade. The agony he had felt at the altar wasn't just his own. It was her terror, her sacrifice, and the crushing weight of a love that had tried to protect him even as he betrayed it. "You speak of dynasties," Theron growled, stepping into her space until the heat radiating from his skin made her flinch. "But a kingdom built on the blood of my mate is a kingdom I will burn to the ground." With a single, sweeping motion, he reached out and snatched the sigil of the Queen Mother from her throat, the silver chain snapping with a sharp, final crack. "You are no longer a queen of Valdron. You are a traitor to the crown and to the blood. You are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your voice in this court." Rivina's mask finally cracked, her face paling to the color of ash. "You would choose a peasant over your own blood? Over your duty?" "I am choosing my soul," Theron roared, the sound echoing through the hollow corridors of the castle. "Get out of my sight before the wolf forgets you gave him life." As she stumbled back, discarded and diminished, Theron turned toward the window overlooking the Blackwood. He didn't care about the politics or the looming war with the Ravencourt line. He could feel the faint, silver thrum of Sable's presence deep within the trees, a ghost of a heartbeat that was no longer fading, but changing. He had cleared the thorns from his own house, and now he would tear the world apart to find the woman who had become his darkness. The Blackwood did not just offer shelter. It became a living mirror, reflecting the fractured truths Sable had spent her life ignoring. Under the silver-tinged canopy of the ancient oaks, Cakes moved like a shadow through the mist, his voice a low, rhythmic tether that pulled Sable deeper into the metaphysical realm known as the Veil. Here, the physical world blurred into a static hum, replaced by a luminous tapestry of shimmering threads that connected every living soul in Valdron. "Do not look with your eyes," Cakes commanded, his presence a stabilizing weight beside her. "Your eyes see only the servant's rags and the king's crown. See the currents, Sable. See the truth of the tether you believe is broken." Sable closed her eyes, and the world ignited. The darkness of the forest vanished, replaced by a vast, pulsating web of light. Most threads were faint, like spider silk in the morning dew, but one was different. It was a thick, jagged cord of molten gold that stretched from her own heart, disappearing through the trees toward the distant silhouette of the castle. This was the bond she had fled, the one she thought had been severed by Theron's spoken vow. But as she reached out with her mind, walking the veil, as the ancient walkers once had, she saw the true nature of the cord. It wasn't dead. It was hemorrhaging. The gold was bruised with deep, obsidian stains of regret and agony. She followed the thread with her newfound sight, her consciousness gliding along the golden path until she saw him. Theron wasn't the triumphant king she had left at the altar. He was a man drowning in a storm of his own making. Through the veil, she felt the raw, unfiltered vibration of his heart. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a man who had moved on. It was a frantic, grieving roar. She saw the moments he had spent in the darkness of his solar, his fingers tracing the phantom sensation of her presence on the floorboards. She felt the weight of the crown he now treated like a leaden shackle, and the searing fury he felt toward the mother who had forced his hand. "He chose her," Sable whispered, her voice echoing in the silver void. "He chose survival," Cakes corrected, his blue eyes appearing in the mist. But his soul never turned. "Look at the thread, Sable. It does not lead to the noblewoman. It bleeds for you." The realization hit her with more force than the betrayal itself. The bond hadn't been replaced, it had been weaponized against him. She watched the golden thread pulse with a sudden, sharp intensity as Theron whispered her name into the night, a plea that vibrated through her very marrow. For the first time, Sable didn't feel like a discarded shadow. She felt like the anchor he was desperately searching for in a rising tide. Under the tutelage of the ancient wolf, the invisible girl began to shed her shame. She wasn't just learning to survive the woods, she was learning to navigate the hearts of kings. She began to weave the shadows around her fingers, no longer a victim of the bond, but its master, preparing to claim a destiny that no highborn queen could ever touch. The moon hung over the Blackwood like a jaundiced eye, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Far from the sanctuary of Cakes's Grove, the forest floor groaned under the weight of a different kind of predator. Lady Maven had not left her daughter's future to chance or the king's wavering sanity. She had summoned a specialist, a silent, shadow-stitch tracker known only as the Vein, whose scent was as cold as iron and whose heart had long ago been replaced by the clink of Ravencourt gold. He moved through the briars without disturbing a single leaf, a silvered crossbow bolted to his arm, his eyes fixed on the faint, shimmering residue of veil light that Sable had unknowingly left in her wake. But the Vein was not the only hunter in the dark. A mile behind him, the forest was being systematically dismantled. Theron moved through the undergrowth with a terrifying, rhythmic violence, his royal garments torn to rags, his chest bare to the biting wind. Beside him, Corvin Blackmere was a silent sentinel of steel, his dual blades unsheathed and reflecting the jagged moonlight. They weren't just tracking a girl, they were tracking a ghost, following the jagged, bleeding vibrations of the bond that Theron could now feel like a physical rope pulling at his sternum. "There," Corvin whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the pines. He pointed to a patch of disturbed moss and a single, discarded bolt, tipped with wolfsbane and coated in the dark, oily sheen of an assassin's trade. Theron's response was a low, vibrating snarl that made the nearby trees shiver. He didn't need words. The scent of the Vein, a chemical, acrid stench, crossed the path of Sable's jasmine and copper, and the king's self-control finally evaporated. He shifted mid-stride, the sound of snapping bone and stretching muscle filling the clearing as a massive, obsidian-furred wolf took his place. They reached the Vein just as the assassin raised his weapon toward a shimmering curtain of mist where Sable's scent was strongest. The confrontation was not a duel, it was an execution. Theron launched himself from the shadows, a 400-pound mass of fury and teeth. The Vein fired, the silver bolt grazing Theron's shoulder and drawing a line of searing, poisoned heat, but the king didn't even flinch. He slammed into the assassin, the force of the impact breaking the man's ribs with the sound of dry wood snapping. Corvin intercepted two other hired blades who emerged from the gloom, his sword spinning in a deadly dance of silver and blood. He moved with the precision of a master, parrying a thrust and returning it with a lethal efficiency that left the clearing littered with the fallen. Theron stood over the gasping tracker, his claws digging into the dirt, his muzzle inches from the man's throat. He didn't kill him instantly. He wanted the man to feel the weight of a king's vengeance. Through the wolf's golden eyes, Theron saw the Ravencourt seal hidden beneath the assassin's cloak. The betrayal was complete. As he finished the work, a sudden, piercing silver light erupted from the mist ahead, Sable's power, reacting to the violence. Theron turned, his blood-stained fur bristling, realizing that while he had killed the hunters, the girl he had come to save was no longer the prey. She was the one watching him from the trees, her silver gaze judging the monster he had become to find her. The altar of souls stood in a clearing where the ley lines of the Blackwood converged, a jagged monolith of obsidian that seemed to draw the very light from the air. Here, the veil was not a curtain but a thin, translucent membrane, pulsing with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Sable stood before the ancient stone, her fingers hovering over its cold, weeping surface. Beside her, the shadows stirred, waiting for the command that would change the history of Valdron. Cakes had taught her the words, the ancient incantation of the Veil Walkers that could reach into the metaphysical fabric of the world and snip the threads of fate. She could be free. She could sever the golden cord that still throbbed with the ghost of Theron's betrayal and finally silence the screaming in her soul. As she pressed her palms against the obsidian, the silver light in her eyes expanded, dragging her deep into the white-hot center of the veil. She reached for the bond, her intent sharpened into a psychic blade, but as she prepared to strike, the thread didn't just vibrate, it opened. A flood of memories that were not her own washed over her, a tidal wave of sensory information that bypassed her defenses. She saw the royal solar through Theron's eyes, saw the way his hands shook as Queen Revina held a dagger to a lock of Sable's hair, promising that the girl would not survive the night if the Ravencourt alliance was rejected. She felt the suffocating weight of his crown, not as a symbol of power, but as a cage that demanded he sacrifice his heart to save his mate's life. Sable gasped, her knees hitting the damp earth as she saw the moment of the claiming from his perspective. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a funeral. She felt the exact second the bond had snapped, the way Theron's internal wolf had recoiled in a horror so profound it had nearly stopped his heart. She saw the tears he had shed in the silence of the armory, the way he had clawed at his own chest, trying to reach the space where she had been. Most devastating of all, she saw his true intent, a plan to secure the throne only long enough to dismantle the laws that kept them apart, a desperate gamble to win her a world where a servant could be a queen. The blade in her mind faltered. The pain she had carried as a badge of betrayal was suddenly reframed as a shared agony. She wasn't the only victim of the Morvain legacy. Theron was a prisoner of the very bloodline he commanded. She looked at the golden thread, bruised and bleeding, and realized that severing it wouldn't just free her, it would destroy the only man who had ever truly seen her. The silver light dimmed as she pulled her hands away from the altar, the silence of the forest feeling heavy with the weight of a new choice. She wouldn't cut the bond. She would use the power of the veil to heal it, not as a servant returning to her master, but as a queen coming to claim what was hers. The altar remained silent, but the shadows around her shifted, no longer guarding a fugitive, but preparing the way for a revolution. The silver mist clinging to the altar of souls parted not with a breeze, but with the sheer, jagged force of a king's desperation. Theron burst into the clearing, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts that clouded in the freezing air. He was a man stripped of his titles, his pride, and his very skin, appearing more like the wild things of the Blackwood than the monarch who had stood under the vaulted ceilings of Valdron. Behind him, Corvin stood guard at the tree line, his blades already slick with the blood of the Ravencourt scouts who had tried to intercept them. Theron stopped dead when he saw her. Sable stood by the obsidian monolith, her hair a wild halo of ink and her eyes swirling with a luminous, terrifying silver. The air around her hummed with the vibration of 1,000 unsung songs. For a moment, the alpha in him coiled to spring, to grab her and pull her back to the safety of the stone walls he had spent his life defending. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw the nobody was gone. In her place was a power that made the ancient oaks bow their heads. He didn't speak a command. He didn't invoke the laws of the pack or the rights of a mate. Instead, the Alpha King of Valdron did the one thing no one in the history of the realm had ever seen him do. He sank to his knees in the damp, blood-stained earth, his head bowed and his palms turned upward in a gesture of absolute surrender. "I am not here to take you back to a cage, Sable," he rasped, his voice cracking with the weight of his redemption. "I am here to ask if you will let me stand in your shadow." The moment of peace was shattered by the rhythmic clatter of heavy armor and the harsh, commanding shouts of Lady Maven's remaining forces. They surged into the clearing, a wall of steel and Ravencourt blue, led by the high priest who cried out for the execution of the abomination who had bewitched the king. They saw only a broken man kneeling before a servant girl. Sable stepped forward, and the very ground beneath the soldiers' feet began to weep shadows. She did not look like a servant. She looked like the personification of the night itself. As she raised her hand, the silver light in her eyes spilled over, illuminating the clearing with a cold, celestial fire that froze the soldiers in their tracks. The shadows rose behind her like a tattered, midnight cape, and the golden bond between her and Theron suddenly flared with a brilliance that blinded the onlookers. It was no longer a tether of possession, but a bridge of light. "You speak of abominations," Sable's voice rang out, no longer a whisper, but a resonant chime that echoed through the veil. "But you are looking at the queen this realm was promised before your greed turned the gods to stone." As she spoke, the Ravencourt banners began to wither and turn to ash in the soldiers' hands. The high priest fell to his knees as the sacred threads of his office were unmade by her gaze. Sable reached down, her fingers brushing Theron's trembling shoulder. The bond healed in a flash of white heat, sealing them together not as master and servant, but as equals. The invisible girl had vanished forever, and in the heart of the Blackwood, the Veil Queen had finally come home to claim her throne.